Hello, my name is Kuba Kucharski and this is the Dev Team Project, a podcast exploring methods, approaches and skills needed to build great engineering teams. So, welcome everyone to another episode of the Dev Team Project podcast. Our guest today is Yuan, VP of Engineering at Upwork and previously the Director of Engineering at Netflix, eBay. So quite a track record there. I've heard about Han the second I finished the interview with Darren Chinan for this podcast, and he was like, "Oh, so I enjoyed this a lot. You need to meet Han." And I was like, "Yes, I need to meet Han." And like we should do the interview together. So like I'm glad you took the time this morning to do this interview, and yeah, like welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. I've heard a lot of good things. Darren said a lot of nice things, and I'm very flattered that Darren suggested me. So thank you.
So let's start like with a bit of your background, like a 2-3 minute version of your bio.
I've been in the Valley for about 20 some odd years, and I think it's been an interesting 20 years because you had to go through the dot-com boom, the crash, the financial crisis. So I've seen a few ups and downs. I happen to have started my career at the very peak of the dot-com boom.
Okay.
Having joined a 300-person startup called Sapa Software. I spent 10 years in enterprise software, but somewhere in the middle, I was inspired to build something on the side, and it was, out on the internet. It was consumer based, and the net result, it was a social network. And while it was not successful, a bunch of my friends joined the network, and a couple of them actually met their future wives, and so I thought there's got to be something here on the consumer side, and so I really dedicated the back half of my career towards projects that are largely consumer facing, which is where the eBay Netflix story comes into play. Upwork is sort of a hybrid. It is internet scale. We do largely focus on business customers. So for me, it has been quite a bit of a full circle.
Yeah, definitely. It's like you've seen it all, and especially you've seen all the downsides, and you build like your things along the way, and both like worked for great companies, and now you're Senior VP of Engineering, right?
I am.
So what is this role about? What does Senior VP of Engineering does?
At Upwork, my main roles, more so when I hired, a little bit less so today, but when I was hired, essentially anything that had anything to do with a computer was under my a world of responsibility, which included things like IT, data science, the tech ops teams.
That's a clear line.
Application engineering, QA, InfoSec. These days, we have separated out the IT and InfoSec concerns out from underneath me. From time to time, I'll also take on additional responsibility, like I happen to be leading the analytics teams at this moment. But that's more or less where those lines blur. Practically speaking, I still consider myself an engineer. I really wish I had the time to write software and check in code in production. I don't do a whole lot of that. What I do is really try to make sure that, unlike an engineer where you're building a website, as an administrator you're really building an organization and building a team, and really trying to understand how that team's operating system works. Where are all the different threads that are happening in this sort of organizational operating system, unblocking those threads, picking the priority thread, and when escalations occur, hopefully my judgment is solid And ultimately, I think there's also a mentorship role, which is making sure that my leadership and frankly leaders across the organization, no matter how far they are from a hierarchy perspective, are empowered to make good decisions.
So what was the size of the organization, like a engineering organization, when you joined?
Our teams have not materially changed from 4.5 years ago when I joined at Upwork. We're still around anywhere between 300 to 400 folks. We're distributed in 40 countries around the world. For me, this is the most distributed engineering team that I've ever had to work with, and that has brought both quite a bit of it's inspired me quite a bit as somebody in the field. But it's also brought to bear really interesting challenges. If you think about how different people are around the world, different cultures, different communication styles, the fact that you can't be in front of them. And so much of our communication is body language, how you communicate and how you set context. Those are all very, very interesting challenges that were new to me here at Upwork, despite the fact that I have had distributed teams in the past, but not at the scale of at Upwork.
But is it like a hybrid of a distributed and remote organization? So some people are like fully remote, or just distributed offices around the world?
One of the amazing things about Upwork, and I think there are very few companies that do this, but we happen to be a marketplace for labor. We actually use the marketplace to source about 2/3 of our engineering team on the platform itself. And so the engineers, in some cases, are in co-working spaces, but the bulk of them are working from home. And so that's, how do you build a community when everybody's at home? Warsaw, in Kiev, Barcelona, other parts of South America.
And it's even harder if some people are in the office together and some people are remote, right? So
and I think that's one of the things that folks talk about, like the benefits of a fully distributed team and the social dynamics of that. It does change versus the dynamics of a fully local team, but the hybrid model is actually pretty difficult to operate. We happen to have a core set of folks here in the Silicon Valley. Our hiring strategy is usually to hire elite engineers, elite administrators here, to the extent that they have a unique perspective on how to scale. So we try to balance the benefit of deep job experience at an internet scale company versus really, really smart engineers at a global scale. And in that sense, I think the strategy works pretty well.
Do you have like any specific policy for dealing with like a water cooler conversation effect and things like that, like policies about meetings, documentations?
One of the things that I think we're still building our muscle is to really think about documenting things in writing. As a concrete example, a lot of people have good ideas, but in order to help systematize how good ideas are shared, at Upwork we have a process that was inspired by the Python enhancement proposal process, which we call, instead of PEP, we call it UPEP, it's called the Upwork. But what the enhancement proposal process does is that it has a fixed approval chain, fixed escalation chain for your proposal, and we encourage teams to be able to document context, talk about what problem they're trying to solve, and really try to democratize ideation. And that's just an example of an emphasis on writing things down. And the reason is because written communication is fundamentally async, and so that allows you to scale your communication. If you require synchronous communication, then you deal with the fundamental issues even though the internet helps bridge the idea of space, you still can't solve time zone problems, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to focusing on async communication, I think is a scaling strategy, and that comes all the way down from normal coordination day to day, as well as just setting context and making decisions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think for me personally, the biggest problem is this. You've mentioned this already. The problem of body language and not being able to get, the whole nonverbal expressions, especially when people are not turning on their video, things like that. So yeah, that's very problematic. And while we're at the documentation, while I was heading here, like on a Caltrain, I saw that you posted on LinkedIn your management principles list, and you've shared also with me the other parts of your like personal documentation. And I must say, I was probably one of the best reads this month.
Thank you.
I actually had goosebumps reading it. Like, there's a lot of, I would say, fanatical approach to transparency there in this document. So I wonder, like, can you say a bit more about this? Like, what is this whole thing creating this kind of open documentation about?
One of the challenges I've experienced as a leader is that you have to figure out ways to humanize yourself a little bit, because at some point people are afraid to give your supervisor feedback. I mean, there's an asymmetry between the authority and the power, and so, but as an individual, there's also a deep realization that I am imperfect, and I can also grow and improve each and every day.
Yeah.
And so how do I break that asymmetry? And I think part of it is documenting your errors and explicating that you are human. The second thing I think is somewhat related to what you talked about, which is in absence of a personal relationship, you and I know each other for many, many years. We work together. How do you get to know me as a leader and how I make decisions? And maybe I have quirks, right? Maybe I'm quick to judge or what have you. But perhaps there's a reason for this. And so bridging that gap was also very valuable. So two things that I did was I started to put down my management principles, specifically around how I make management decisions. And then secondly, because they are essentially aspirational, right? They're values. Ultimately, the goal is to, hopefully as an individual, you say, hey, those are actually Han's virtues. There is a difference between values and virtues. And so as an individual, holding myself accountable, being able to report on my errors from time to time when I have not lived up to the principles I aspire to, is a way for me to learn. And by documenting them, people feel more comfortable telling me, you know what, Han, you said you wanted to do this, but this is what you did. And that becomes a very black and white thing, an objective thing, a non-personal thing. And I found that people feel a lot more comfortable giving me feedback in that framework.
So how do you work with this document? There are three sections there. Like, there are principles, then there are mistakes, and experiments, right? So there are like three sections of this document. Can you tell a bit more how you work with this document?
The principles are essentially the values and the rules. The experiments are hypotheses. Like, what if I did this? Do they eventually is this actually useful from a management perspective? And so, and I put the experiments down because as a leader, sometimes people are always upset, like, why is he doing that these days? Or, why is he not bringing his phone to meetings? And things of that ilk. And you want to give people an explanation for what you were trying to do and what you were trying to achieve, so that you become more predictable. And then after the fact, what I will do with these experiments is I will pull the staff to say, hey, was this useful or not? You saw me change for this period of time. Do you think it was useful or not? If so, then they eventually graduate to the principal section. Mm-hmm. The error log is essentially a description of which principle I violated and when, and whether or not the outcome is do better, or maybe I should try and experiment because there's a gap in the logic of some of the principles.
Mm-hmm. And do people read that? Do people actually like discuss with you? Like, do you like, like how it is with documentation? Sometimes there's something that is just laying somewhere and no one is touching it even with a stick. So like, do you find that people are engaging with this document, which is just representations of your learnings and principles?
For better or worse, I don't think people stalk the document regularly. In fact, I even have an experiment in the document itself to say, like, if you read up to this point, then add a comment. But there are key folks that I will typically update and say, like, hey, I've made an update to the document. Usually I review the document on a monthly basis and add entries as appropriate. And
it's just like a plain Google Doc, right?
It's a plain
Google
Doc.
Don't use anything fancy for this, just a plain Google Doc.
The public document that you described, which, by the way, I published in preparation for this.
Awesome.
So it was for you, man. The public document does not contain experiments and errors because those are obviously very company specific. Mm-hmm. But within the company, that document is widely shared and visible to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you think this is something that might work for someone else in the company, like people that are holding roles of engineering managers, for example? Is this relevant to them? Are they trying to do this?
I think that's a good question. That's also one of the reasons I wrote that LinkedIn article. Mm-hmm. Is to encourage people to try it. I have found that my colleagues have not adopted the same approach, mm-hmm. although I do get feedback that, hey, this is useful. I don't really know the reasons for it, mm-hmm. but I can tell you that from my own experience, it's actually deeply uncomfortable because many of the things that, how we make decisions, there's generally no right or wrong answer. And so to expose yourself in such a transparent way is a deeply uncomfortable thing. It does expose yourself to being judged. And I think that's a challenge. But I think the benefits of doing that, at least for me personally, have far outweigh the discomfort.
Yeah, it's just very scary to publish, a list of your mistakes. And if everyone would be doing this, maybe it would be less scary, but it's not the case. Like if you're the first one to try this, that's probably going to be tough in the beginning, right?
But you want to open up yourself to that, and I think the person to do that is the head of engineering, right? Because if the head of engineering can make mistakes, then everybody can admit their mistakes, and that's going to be fine.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I do think there's value in this for folks that are in leadership roles at all levels. But I would encourage people, especially the most senior people, to consider it.
Okay, so let's take one mistake and share it with people. I know you're not sharing the full list, but this one we can share. And it goes like this. I didn't realize that a key project was ill-equipped to succeed because not enough coordination progress had been made, and now the deadline is just a few months away. And I read this yesterday, and I realized that I made the same mistake in the past, and I've heard about my friends making those mistakes, and I wonder why we engineering leaders, why are we making this kind of mistake?
I think it's a great question. I think it's very difficult to solve. In Andy Grove's book, High Performance Management, he talks about this idea of task relevant maturity, mm-hmm. and it's a framework around when you should delegate versus when you should get more involved in a direct report's work. And I think the root of many of these kinds of failure patterns is rooted in that it's basically a miscalculation in terms of, I think this person's got it, so I'm going to be more hands off, versus they really don't have it. And I think that's where that danger, and when you misread task relevant maturity for a program owner or project owner, what you end up doing is you may have delegated too much of your understanding into that. Now, this brings up a separate problem, which is now something very important is about to run off the tracks. Like, what do you do? And in those cases, I've always, and this is where I think the management principle comes in, is you could let it run off the tracks and allow your person or your direct report to learn a lesson and learn from their mistakes. But I find the practicum of that to be somewhat dangerous, because when you do that, you end up potentially allowing your customers to pay for the tuition of your own staff. And so in those cases, I've also documented that I will not allow that, and so I will get very involved. And I think it's an example of, there's probably no right or wrong answer, but when I do get very involved, my hope is that my colleagues understand the reason that Han is getting involved is because he does not want the customers to pay for my mistake or the tuition of my colleagues.
Or he's very interested in understanding this problem really, really well, to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. I like how you mentioned two principles already that are so the task relevant maturity and not allowing for customers to pay that tuition of the organization. That's cool. So those principles, they all also have sections. So there's delegation. We already talked about one of this. The second section is hiring, and there's one point there, hire people who possess multi-dimensional skills or think diagonally naturally. Why is that important?
That's a preference.
That's just your preference?
It's a preference.
Okay.
Right, but imagine, this is a great example where there's no right or wrong answer, right? Some engineering leaders and some engineering organizations, they'll structure their organization in terms of front end, back end, data. I personally have always preferred to hire full stack engineers that are up and down. They're not necessarily going to be the best at the front end. Maybe their back end's a little bit janky, but I like full stack people. And the preference comes from this ability to be diagonal, to be able to scale up and down, to be able to think across multiple domains, just because I have a preference for leading teams with some workforce flexibility, so that we can move people around as needed. But that's definitely a style thing, right? But it's useful to know that Han has these biases when you're working with me, because these are the kinds of people that I like to work with. I like to work with generalists versus specialists, if you will. I attempt to explicate why I have that preference, but at the end of the day, it's a preference.
Yeah. So there's pretty much a consensus around cross-functional teams, but what you mean by this is you would prefer a team of 4 full-stack engineers to 2 back-end and 2 front-end engineers.
Right. Okay. I would prefer to work with engineers also to have a broader viewpoint on the world. I like working with engineers who care about the business, who have some business sense, who care about the user experience. And so when I define diagonal thinking, it goes beyond just the engineering colleagues and their core disciplines, but having a broader view of what we're building or why we're building. But some people are just going to say, hey, I only want to hire the person who's the world's greatest microservices architect. That's good, right? There's a role for those kinds of individuals, but my proclivities are generally I get a lot more excited when I see somebody who's very broad and hopefully deep in some areas.
That makes sense. So let's move on to the separations section. And there's this one: keep separations honorable and reveal what is necessary, but do not lie to the existing team about the reasons. And I think we all know why it's important to like be honest, and you know how all the engineers are pretty much bullshit detectors, and so you have to be honest. But sometimes it gets so hard, right? You know, the truth can be, you know, I don't want to use the word ugly, but not nice, right? And what do you do then? Like how you handle, you know, being honest about the reasons?
I think first of all, you have to be honest enough to explain that it was voluntary versus involuntary. So I think signaling that.
Okay.
But how strongly you signal that, I mean, there are labor laws and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I personally don't recommend that. Mm-hmm. But I do think that in any case, in any kind of separation, it's useful to talk about what the individual's contributions were. And regardless, you know, celebrate your time together, you know, have a lunch, have a dinner. I think those things are very important because there are two reasons why you have to do this duality. One is authenticity, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't come off as authentic, then mm-hmm. fundamentally your team's not going to trust you. Mm-hmm. They may not agree with your decision on the separation, and that sometimes will happen, mm-hmm. right? They're like, "Wow, I can't believe we let that person. That we're so good. And what were they thinking?" But mm-hmm. at least you were not dishonest about that. You didn't try to, try to fool anybody. And then, but the second thing is that it's important to treat people well on their exit, because if you were in their shoes, you would want to be treated that way. And then, by transitivity, your team is also watching how you treat people, because if that ever happens to them, they don't want to be mistreated too. Mm-hmm. And so it's important, I think, to be mindful of that. And so that's why mm-hmm. that principle exists for me. Mm-hmm.
Okay, another one from decision making. Champion the idea of meritocracies, but dare to run an autocracy if you have to. And here's the tricky part: how you run a meritocracy without falling into like a democracy trap, right? It happens so often.
Right. And I think that the key is that it might be useful to define a meritocracy, or at least the way I think about it, mm-hmm.
Which,
in the absence of a dictionary, I'm just going to make it up.
Yeah.
But when I think about a meritocracy, it's really both ingesting somebody's decision-making and opinion and weighing it against, like, does this person actually an expert in what they're talking about? And I think this is not a precise science, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of weighing everyone's opinion, but like deep down you go, like, you know, this individual, it really is an enterprise architect. They probably know what they're doing. And this person, like, they read it on mm-hmm. a blog post. And so it's a good idea, but I'll have to double click into it. It is very difficult sometimes to run an organization like that. But what I find is that more often than not, I actually don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so it is useful to make sure that you create an open environment where that debate happens. There are cases, though, where you will find, and this is where I think a leader needs to step in, is that there are times when things absolutely have to have a single decision maker. Mm-hmm. Even at Upwork, we've had some pretty challenging times over the years. You need one person to say, this is what's happening in the production environment. We're doing the rollback. We're taking the site down and doing emergency maintenance. And there will be debate. So we can't do this or we can't do that. But at some point, somebody needs to make the call. And being very clear on protocols and when they matter mm-hmm. In those crisis moments is really key. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of these things, I think, frequently have to be documented. Mm-hmm. If you read our site reliability engineering manual, we have protocols on how to manage your mental state. What are the protocols to overthrow the incident commander in case they've been compromised? Communication protocols, all the way down to at what time and at what phase we need to communicate with each other.
Wow, it's like Star Trek, right?
Oh, it absolutely is.
That's so cool. Like, So you go into the autocracy mode when there's like a crisis and like a lot of time pressure and things like that.
Right. I think the when you go into autocracy mode is a function of how much time you have and how bad things are, right? If you don't have a lot of time and the stakes are high, then you have to bias towards speed of decision making. And this is where I think likely you hope that if you have a hierarchy of decision makers, hopefully the person at the top makes better, generally good decisions than, or is it generally a better decision maker? Because there are those times when somebody has to make the call.
And how do you deal with the aftermath? So like sometimes going into autocracy mode leaves some kind of, feeling in people, there's this, maybe like a small trauma or something like this. Things are happening. Well, so how you, get back into we're working together, deciding those things together, things like that.
I think usually those horrible things don't have a different problem, like something happened, right?
Okay.
And so I think, again, documenting our mistakes, like not even as individuals, but as an organization is critical. And so at least at Upwork specifically, we have a pretty rich and rigorous postmortem process. And so if somebody had to go into autocracy mode or I had to, we can go through the logic of why that happened. And I think that helps normalize the day-to-day operations.
Yep. Clear policy definitely helps. So let's get back to your experiment with leaving smartphone at the desk to evaluate which group meetings are actually worth my time. Is this experiment finished? Are you still doing this?
I am still doing it. It happened because one of my colleagues basically said that I was checking my phone a lot during her meetings.
Yeah.
And she described how she was feeling when I did that, and it made me feel bad because that was not my intention. There are times when I actually do need to be reached. I'm getting pinged by admins, or there's a site incident, or a decision needs to be made at that moment in the meeting.
Okay, sure.
But I wanted to find out what was the trade-off of not responding to those versus creating the psychological safety that I am actually present, or as present as I can be. I think at this point in time, I think the trade-off has been worth it.
Okay.
I think in exchange, I will carry an iPad into meetings from time to time, but I actually don't use the keyboard mode at all on the iPad, and so I just handwrite notes to make sure that I don't fall into bad habits.
Yeah. But I wonder, if the outcome is you're just more present at the meetings, or you got rid of some meetings too. Did you realize that some meetings are not necessary for you, for example, because you're not engaging on those meetings?
Yeah. It has not happened that I've gotten rid of meetings, unfortunately.
Sorry.
But I think that's part of the job, right? You being there in that meeting was important to somebody, and I think understanding the reasons behind that is also important. And it may be the case that you know everything in this meeting already, but there's probably a reason that you were invited, and sometimes it's, for better or worse, sometimes it's just ceremony, right?
Yeah, true. So with all this being radically transparent, have you ever got in trouble for publishing something in this document, or you've noticed that something was harder for you because this document was out there?
I think it is. I think getting the feedback is pretty difficult to.
Feedback on the document, or feedback
in general? In general,
because
because when you do publish errors, or you say that you're going to be radically transparent,
Mm-hmm.
then sometimes that feedback comes like in public, right? And in this particular case, it came from a a public channel.
Okay.
It's pretty uncomfortable. But on the flip side, it does hold you accountable, right? Because you will have to own up to it, and I think that is the cost of this type of policy.
But how should this work? Should the feedback to you be given like in a private channel, or like what would be your preference there? Like I guess getting like tough feedback on a public channel of the company might be even disrupting some things, right?
It could be, but sometimes you can't pick and choose, right?
Yeah.
If you claim that you're radically transparent, then you have to be able to accept the radical transparency.
Okay, so I read the document, but there was no like actual pointers on whether like someone in your company should give you feedback like in private or in public.
No.
So you're just waiting for this to happen and deal whatever happens.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And then I also give them the options to do it. I poll them, and so we do regular monthly polls and things like that.
But I really like it. Like I also think that like this episode is sort of advocacy for this kind of transparency amongst engineering leaders. So let's move on and talk about how your everyday look like. What are some framework that you use, some tools that you use? How do you operate like day to day?
But most of my day is planned in advance, and so prior to the day, I will review my schedule. I will also do quite a bit of journaling and reflection on figuring out what are things that I need to get done by this day. And usually that's driven by a second set of planning where I plan what are the objectives that I need to get done for the week. And then that, of course, feeds into what were my annual goals are on what I want to get done for the organization. As most senior people, you usually define your own goals, but being able to reflect on your annual weekly goals on a weekly basis and your daily goals to support your objectives on the week is part of my planning process. Practically speaking, there are sort of things that you need to do immediately, and then there are things that are probably not immediate. And so figuring out what to do when, I deploy an approach called the Eisenhower matrix. It is essentially a 2x2 that says, urgency on one axis and immediacy on another axis. Obviously, the important urgent things you just have to go do, and so you either do it immediately or you try to get some time for it. Then the urgent, not important things, try to delegate it, and this is part of the Eisenhower matrix.
Okay, is it the same matrix as in Stephen Covey's book, like this?
It could be. Yeah.
That sounds like that.
But the critical one, and I think in the long run, this is probably the most important box that I found as both on a personal level as well as the administrator of an organization, is really to figure out ways to address the important, not urgent things, because those tend to be the most important. And so what I will also do is I have a long-running list of important, not urgent projects, and I will schedule times to work on them. And in certain cases, if I know that it is a long-running thing, I will schedule recurring meetings where I systematically chew on them. And so my day-to-day tends to be quite rigid because there are normal meetings that I have with people. Then there is blocked off desk time.
So you schedule like a bigger blocks of desk time, of like focus time?
For me, it's my minimum time is 30 minutes. And usually I will go up to 1 hour and a half or 2. I've also done time studies on myself, especially when I've been writing code, where every 30 minutes I'll use the Pomodoro method, and then basically journal whether or not I was effective. And so over a long period of time, I know for myself, I am most productive, like when I'm writing code specifically, between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m.
Okay.
And beyond that, my productivity falls off, even though I think I'm working very hard. So if you ever hire me as a software engineer, you're only going to get 5 hours of work out of me.
That makes sense. Like, are you still coding? Like, would you consider yourself like still technical, deeply technical?
I think so, but I think most people wouldn't. But I really like writing code, and I still do a lot of it. On my free time and at home. It's definitely a passion of mine.
To keep up with the tech, you're coding on your own. Like, what kind of projects?
My long time, I tend to be more I would say like I consider myself full stack, but I'm much more passionate about front end technologies. These days, in some ways I'm still old school, but I've always been impressed with the opinionated nature of Ruby on Rails, and so a lot of my projects tend to be either Ruby or ROR projects. But I feel like we're in this kind of bold new world of client-side JavaScript. All these frameworks are super fun, like Vue and React, and I'm just having a blast.
Okay. Learning those new frameworks.
But even on the back end, it's just amazing. Like, you have cloud computing, you have containers, playing with Kubernetes cluster. It's so fun. It's an amazing time to be a software engineer. Yeah,
exciting times. So I can see that we kind of need to start wrapping up. So one last question for you. If you could give only one advice to all the higher level engineering leaders out there, what would it be?
I would say that for you to scale, at least this is for me to scale, I found that it's almost imperative to figure out ways to bridge the authority that you have with the actual control from the people doing the real work. Because of the fact that of all the information asymmetry, right? Like, as passionate as I am and as much as I want to do the work, nobody would allow me to do it, here at Upwork. But at the same time, like, figuring out, bridging the challenges of making decisions because I have the authority. You're never going to scale if you end up making all the decisions yourself. And so figuring out systems that will allow you to have authority that's distributed as far down to the organization as possible is critical. And I think it's easier said than done, especially if you enter into an existing organization. That is a long process of breaking that down. But the deeper you can get down, the more the organization can scale, the more the organization will be resilient to failures or gaps in the decision-making hierarchy. And if folks are successful, they'll be able to create a system that can run independent of the existence of themselves. And I think that that's the ultimate goal of any leader, to be able to manage themselves out of a job.
I think it's a brilliant piece of advice, and thank you for being here, for taking the time to do this interview. We'll be sharing the links to Hans' management principles too, so you can read all of them. And thank you, and see you in another episode.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It was a fun talk.